My father waved his golden VIP invitation right in front of my face like a trophy, the crisp White House seal catching the morning light. "Look all you want, but you weren't invited," he smirked, his voice dripping with that familiar contempt. He and my golden boy brother laughed, stepping toward the security check-in, completely expecting me to be turned away in humiliation. I didn't argue. I didn't shed a tear. I simply walked up to the podium and handed the chief hostess my invitation. She scanned the code, and the uniform smile on her face completely vanished. Her eyes widened, her hands began to tremble, and she went absolutely pale. She slowly looked up from her screen, completely ignoring my father, and stared at the four-star admiral standing right beside her. In a voice that shook the entire room, she whispered, "Sir, she's here. My name is Chloe, and I am 27 years old. For as long as I can remember, my existence was treated as nothing more than a footnote in my own family's history." My father, Richard, had built a sprawling real estate empire on a foundation of ruthless greed and compromises, and to him, the only thing that mattered was status. Naturally, my older brother Brandon was the golden child. He was molded in our father's exact image, arrogant, entitled, and entirely hollow. At family dinners, Richard would raise his glass to Brandon's latest corporate exploits, while my quiet career in public service was dismissed as a total failure. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to believe I was powerless. Before we continue, follow my story until the end and comment the city you are watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. For years, I sat in the shadows of their toxic luxury, quietly enduring the mocking remarks and the casual cruelty. They honestly believed that because I refused to join their corrupt business, I had no ambition. But while Brandon was busy learning how to manipulate people for profit, I was learning something far more dangerous. I was learning how to seek the truth. They thought they had successfully pushed me into the background, but what they didn't realize was that the background is the perfect place to watch a house of cards prepare to fall. The crisp morning air inside our family's estate felt heavier than usual the day the letter arrived. It was an official envelope, thick and embossed with a gleaming gold presidential seal. Brandon practically ripped it open, his face lighting up with a smug, self-satisfied grin. They had done it. Richard and Brandon had managed to secure highly exclusive VIP invitations to an elite military honoring ceremony at the White House, an event reserved only for the country's highest echelons of society and power. For the next 2 weeks, my father and brother flaunted those invitations ruthlessly. They left them on the kitchen island, brought them up at every meal, and made absolutely sure I knew that I was completely excluded from the family's crowning moment of social validation. To them, it was the ultimate proof of my insignificance. "A shame your little government desk job doesn't come with perks like this, Chloe," Brandon would sneer across the dinner table, while Richard chuckled into his whiskey. What neither of them knew, however, was that my quiet career wasn't quite what it seemed. For the past few years, I had been operating under a highly classified, high-level federal umbrella that my family knew absolutely nothing about. I kept my true position entirely secret, letting them believe whatever they wanted, purely to protect the integrity of my intense, ongoing investigation. The night before the gala, Richard didn't even look up from his papers when he delivered his latest demand. He didn't want to deal with DC traffic or private drivers, so he ordered me to act as their unpaid chauffeur for the morning. They wanted me to drive them to the gates of the White House just to witness their grand entry while I was left outside. I simply nodded and agreed. The traffic along Pennsylvania Avenue was suffocating, but Brandon and Richard sat in the back seat of my car like kings preparing for a coronation. When we finally reached the high-security perimeter of the White House, they adjusted their expensive suits, stepped out, and ordered me to park the car and wait. But instead of returning to the driver's seat, I stepped into the security line right behind them. The security checkpoint was a flawless operation of stone-faced guards and high-tech biometric terminals. As we approached the front, my father proudly brandished his gold-trimmed VIP invitation card to the staff, holding it up like a priceless trophy. He turned around to look at me, a cruel, mocking smirk twisting his face as he delivered his final public insult. "Look all you want, Chloe, but you weren't invited," he whispered loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear. I didn't utter a word. I didn't let my expression waver. Instead, I calmly bypassed my brother and father, stepped directly up to the chief hostess desk, and presented a completely different card, a highly restricted, encrypted federal security clearance badge. The hostess took my badge and scanned the embedded QR code into her secure terminal. Instantly, the machine let out a distinct, high-pitched clearance chime that echoed across the stone entry. The uniform, polite smile completely vanished from the hostess's face. Her eyes widened, her hands began to visibly tremble, and her entire face went absolutely pale as she stared at the screen. The hostess frantically flagged down the commanding four-star admiral who was overseeing the strict event protocols. She leaned in, her voice cracking with an intense urgency as she whispered, "Sir, she's here." Richard smirked, assuming the guard was about to have me forcibly removed from the premises for trespassing. He opened his mouth to make another snide remark, but the words died instantly in his throat. The admiral turned sharply, his eyes locking onto me. Instead of calling for security, his posture went completely rigid, and he snapped his hand up to his brow in a deeply respectful, unyielding military salute. The heavy silence in the security checkpoint was deafening. The truth was finally out in the open. I wasn't a pathetic tag-along guest desperate for a glimpse of high society. I was the actual guest of honor. For the past 2 years, I had been operating as the lead legal investigator for the Navy JAG Corps. I had quietly and methodically dismantled a massive, multi-million-dollar federal corruption ring that had compromised high-level operations across the country. My badge wasn't a standard entry pass, it was a maximum clearance escort directive. Richard and Brandon watched in utter, jaw-dropping silence as the velvet ropes were pushed aside exclusively for me. 2 heavily decorated officers stepped forward to act as my personal honor guard, gesturing for me to lead the way into the main hall. I walked past my father and brother without giving them a single glance, leaving them stranded, confused, and utterly humiliated at the very back of the ordinary security line. As the formal ceremony commenced inside the majestic hall, Richard and Brandon were escorted to the very back row, their elite egos completely shattered. They sat in stunned silence under the towering crystal chandeliers, surrounded by dignitaries, while I was seated at the main ceremonial table at the very front of the room. The contrast was absolute, a visual representation of how completely the power dynamic had shifted in a single moment. The Admiral stepped up to the podium, his voice echoing through the stateroom as he introduced the evening's highest accolade. He began to speak about the Distinguished Public Service Award, describing the relentless dedication required to expose deep-rooted systemic deception. When he finally called my full official title and name, the entire room erupted into applause. I took the stage calmly, looking out over the crowd of influential figures. As I began my acceptance speech, I spoke clearly about the true meaning of integrity and justice. I noted that real success cannot be bought through backroom deals or inherited through unearned privilege. I looked directly into my father's eyes from across the massive hall as I delivered the line, ensuring he felt the full weight of the warning. Right at that moment, several federal agents in crisp, formal suits quietly entered through the side doors of the hall, positioning themselves along the perimeter. I watched from the podium as a sickening realization began to wash over Richard's face. The prestige he thought he was chasing had turned into a trap, and the daughter he had mocked was the one who had set it. The true depth of my multi-year investigation was finally laid bare before them. The massive, fraudulent corruption ring I had spent my entire career quietly dismantling hadn't just been funded by random corporate entities. It was secretly anchored by my father's real estate empire and fueled by my brother Brandon's intricate web of fraudulent shell companies. They had spent years thinking they were entirely untouchable, hiding behind expensive lawyers and fabricated balance sheets. What they didn't know was that the exclusive White House invitations they had flaunted so ruthlessly were never a reward for their high social status. It was a calculated, deliberate trap orchestrated by federal law enforcement. We needed to get both men into a heavily secured federal building where they could not escape, destroy their electronic evidence, or alert their corrupt associates. They had walked right into the snare, blinded by their own immense vanity. As the gala reached its formal conclusion, the music faded, and the federal officers stationed at the perimeter stepped forward. They approached Richard and Brandon's table in the back row, calmly but firmly flashing their credentials before ushering them out through a restricted side exit. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked into place beneath the shadows of their tailored suit jackets, keeping the arrest quiet enough to avoid a public scene, but violent enough to shatter their lives forever. Richard turned his head desperately, his eyes pleading, looking back at me on the stage for some kind of help or familial mercy. I simply turned my back to him, choosing instead to shake hands with my colleagues. I was finally completely free from their decades of toxic emotional manipulation. 3 months later, the dust from the investigation had finally settled. My father's corrupt real estate empire completely collapsed under the weight of federal indictments, and Brandon was facing significant prison time without the possibility of bail. They were finally answering for the lifetime of damage they had inflicted on innocent people. Meanwhile, I chose to walk away from the chaos of Washington, D.C., relocating to a charming, peaceful cottage in Carmel overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Sitting on the porch, watching the waves crash against the rocks, I realized that my father's cruelest words had actually been the greatest catalyst for my ultimate victory. By pushing me into the background, they inadvertently gave me the power to tear down their kingdom. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were mocked by your own family at such a massive event? Would you have stayed quiet to set the trap? Or would you have confronted them right then and there? Comment below to let me know. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.